Good morning and welcome to a presentation sponsored by the Garrett Planning Network for members of the Garrett Planning Network and NAPFA and our friends in the industry. This is a wonderful opportunity to learn about what's going on with the Institute for the Fiduciary Standard. We have two of my favorite people presenting, and I'm not just saying that because they're here, Knut Rostad and Mary Malgoire. Knut, many of you are familiar that I've been involved with the Committee for the Fiduciary Standard since its founding, and it was because of Knut. He brought together a group of some amazing minds, and I got the opportunity to be invited to play with some of these amazing minds, getting to know him and the work that has been done through the committee, and then now the Institute. The Institute is the permanent fixture about, you know, best practices. How do we get to a fiduciary culture? So these two are rock stars in their own rights, both in the fiduciary world, but also in their movement. Mary being one of the founders of NAPFA and a long-term active member of NAPFA. I have goosebumps saying that just because you know, you don't see that very often from a leader of the industry that sticks around for 30 or 40 years, still in a leadership capacity, even after technical retirement from financial planning or her firm. So now she's jumped on board, and I am really delighted to be involved with this Best Practices Affirmation Program. I think it is a really outstanding program. I personally endorsed it. I'm very interested in promoting it, and hence the reason why we're here. So without further ado, Knut's going to talk about the Best Practices program for 10-15 minutes, something like that. Then we're going to take questions. So if you have any questions as they come up, feel free to chat them in the questions area or the chat area, or when we break for questions, feel free to hold up your hand and we'll take you off mute and you can ask your question out loud. Either way is completely fine. And then Mary, we'll spend some time, Mary Malgoire, she'll take the next portion and talk to us a little bit about the Institute's campaign for investors. Another very interesting, and I'm super excited about what's going on. This is a program when myself and Bill Pruitt were at the spring NAPFA conference. We ran into a few people who, when they learned about it, they said, "I've got to share this with everyone that I know in this industry. This is something we really need to get behind." So the reception's been really great. Glad you're all here. Please spread the word to your colleagues out there. And without further ado, it's over to you, Knut.
Well, thank you very much, Cheryl. Mary and I both very much appreciate this opportunity to talk about the best practices and the best practices affirmation program. And we want to welcome all of your members, as well as NAPFA members and ACP members that may be also on the line. In the next 15 minutes or so, what I will cover is a little bit of background on the Institute in terms of how we came together and what we're doing. Then review what the best practices are and offer an opinion on how they compare and line up with the CFP board standards. And then go into the Best Practices Affirmation Program, what and why, and then how we believe the program benefits advisors as well as investors. And then at that point, as you said, we'll take whatever questions are out there, and then Mary will speak a little bit about the complementary role of the campaign for investors. The Institute is a nonprofit that was founded in 2011. Myself and 5 others, to provide research, advocacy, and education to advance fiduciary principles and practices in investment and financial advice. The Institute produces papers and blogs, webinars, and programs to fulfill its mission, which includes Fiduciary September, which is coming up. It's right around the corner. We've got all sorts of events planned for that. And we are honored and humbled to have some of the best-known luminaries in the broader financial industry to be supporters and advisors to us, and this includes Vanguard founder Jack Bogle, former SEC Commissioner Luis Aguilar, and law professor Tamar Frankel. We are also proud to have a number of leading advisors involved in our activities and programs from the Chairman's Council, which is comprised of larger RIAs who provide support and advice to the Institute. I want to make a special note that that NAPFA joined with us over basically a 24-month period as we developed best practices as a partner in that endeavor. And the Institute's Best Practices Board includes NAPFA members Bill Pruitt and Chris Cannon, who were integral in the nuts and bolts of coming up with the best practices. And then we are very proud to have TD Ameritrade as the exclusive sponsor of Fiduciary September. So that's a little bit on the background of the Institute. Now I want to switch over a little bit and sort of set the stage for where we are have gone with the best practices and why we think they're so essential. The DOL rule has undoubtedly increased investor awareness of fiduciary and started to move the brokerage industry in the right direction towards fiduciary. This has all been very positive. However, at the same time, there have been some unintended consequences, we think, of the DOL rule. It's led to some uncertainty and confusion as to when, where, and how broker-dealers will interpret and apply the rule. And I think we're seeing that evident almost every day in news reports as we go through this last period, this final period, I should say, of phasing in of the DOL rule itself. But in this process, the DOL rule has put greater pressure on the Securities and Exchange Commission to take charge and make a uniform standard of its own uniform standard. The pressure for a significant uniform standard is real, and it's not good, frankly, for either advisors who are true fiduciaries and/or investors. So you could say, well, how has this come about? Well, the slide I have up here right now gives you a sense of where we have come from in terms of the simple issue of what it means to provide objective and competent advice. And this goes back to the Supreme Court case from 1963, where they reviewed the Advisors Act and laid out very clearly that the key purpose of the act was to separate sales and advice, and to make sure that they are viewed and regulated as different entities. So that is where we began in terms of the regulatory view, and that to remember that where we began, I think, is important to fully appreciate sort of where we are now regarding how regulators review, look at the differences between brokerage sales, and fiduciary advice. And this quote comes from the former SEC chair, Mary Jo White, of just 2 years ago, where she expresses clearly that, in her view, the brokerage sales recommendations and advice are what? Essentially identical conduct. I'm not sure how much this current view of the SEC, as represented in the former chair and as represented in many other ways as well, is sort of well known among advisors. But I think this is something that we should think about. We think about how many federal regulators and the brokerage industry generally believe, that the planners on this webinar, i.e. fee-only, fiduciary, true fiduciary planners, in a sense, they do not exist. That's right. You, as a planner, do not exist in this view. And by this I mean, from a regulatory perspective, fee-only, true fiduciary advice does not exist as a distinct and important, much less a superior, way to serve clients. You are literally just the same as all the others, and or as popularly known in this view that is prevalent. It is a matter of excuse me. Let me go one more. Thinking of us that we are literally one.
Did somebody turn off their
family. And
sorry, did you turn?
I'm sorry, I'm going to start singing. Dancing's already started.
Can you go back?
You have a problem.
Okay. Obviously the point was to get across the idea that in the view of these regulators, there is no material difference between what advisors on this webinar do every day and brokers from the largest wirehouses to the independents do every day. We are family in this view, and that is, in my view, just a reality of where we are today regarding many regulators and the brokerage industry, and sort of sets the stage for the fact that we have a problem. Yes, Tom Hanks is widely known for his role in Apollo 13, and it's this infamous quote, and I think, unfortunately, it's very apt to what we face. And that is the problem or challenge of fee-only fiduciary advisors face is every bit as important. It's the debate over the very meaning of what advice is. And it's not complicated, it's pretty straightforward. The industry clearly presumes that conflicts are unavoidable and acceptable on the one hand, as well as believing that conflicted advice can be good for investors, while we on this webinar clearly and unabashedly do not believe this. This is the environment, this is the landscape which we believe sets the stage for what we have tried to do with the best practices. And the best practices and the affirmation program have been designed to address investor uncertainty and confusion around who is and who is not a true fiduciary and what to expect from a true fiduciary. They have been designed to let true fiduciaries set themselves apart by what they do that is concrete and verifiable, and what clients want and value, and put in plain writing that is understandable. The best practices have been endorsed by a number of industry luminaries, a couple who I've already mentioned, starting with Jack Bogle and Jane Bryant Quinn, as well as we have to all acknowledge and remember and thank our own leaders within the advice world, from Cheryl to Cheryl Holland, Dan Moyson, and Skip Schweiss as perhaps some of the better known advisors or those in the advisor space. So the 12 best practices themselves boil down to a few words for each practice, are pretty straightforward and clear and to the point. And I will just run through them to sort of emphasize that they are clear, we believe, and to the point, and then open up for questions about any of the particular ones afterwards. Starting with the first one is to be a fiduciary all the time. Number 2, to be reasonable. Number 3, to communicate agreements and disclosures in writing. Number 4, to be clear about costs in writing. Number 5, really avoid conflicts. And what does that mean? That means that you minimize your conflicts to the extent humanly possible, and then manage and mitigate those that you cannot avoid. Number 6, to avoid principal trading unless the client literally requests that itself, literally requests a principal trade. And then going on to, in terms of commissions, to really avoid commissions and then manage and mitigate those that are not avoided. Number 8, to avoid gifts and entertainment. Number 9, possess and maintain essential technical knowledge, competence, and education. Number 10, use an IPS or an IPP, an investment policy process, and then control investment expenses, and then affirm again in writing the compliance of your compliance with these practices. These are the 12 items as highlighted in brief. Of course, the actual language and the actual language is in the best practices document itself, and which goes in just a little bit more detail over 2 pages. So those are the best practices. In summary, the Best Practices Affirmation Program, in essence, it seeks to have advisors subscribe to the highest level of practices that are available in the industry. Number 1, it includes what we consider a robust self-regulation mechanism, and which means very specifically that the best practices 2-page document is put on the advisor's website, and there is explicit language put on the advisor's ADV to clearly tell the regulators that this is what you do. And then there's a modest annual fee for the best practices program, and to be on the National Registry of Best Practice Advisors. So in a nutshell, in terms of thinking about why should an advisor who's a true fiduciary subscribe to best practices, I think of 4 or 5 reasons that come top of mind that we have heard from advisors who participate and have learned along the way. The first is offers a straightforward means for investors to screen and evaluate advisors. 2, it's a way to differentiate yourself and your firm with objective criteria in terms of what you do as opposed to what other firms say they do. 3, it is a matter of being part of initiatives and a nonprofit that offers tools and guidance, including the Campaign for Investors, to cut through the clutter and confusion for investors, that provides education and advocacy to advance true fiduciary principles and practices that are essential to being a profession, that is honored to be supported by some of the luminaries in the industry and those best-known leaders, some of the best-known leaders and true fiduciaries in the trenches, and that perhaps in some ways, most importantly, that encourages advisors to speak out in the public square, at conferences, in blogs, in the media, on what fiduciary duties and best practices mean and why they matter to investors. That essentially urges advisors to lead in this effort to move the advisory industry towards being a true profession. So at the end of the day, it is, in our view, part of what other groups are trying to do in terms of moving the advisory industry along and urging individual advisors to be part of making this movement towards the profession as concrete and as real as possible. So that in a nutshell is an overview of the Institute of the Best Practices and the Best Practices Affirmation Program. So at this point, I'll stop and open it up for questions.
That sounds great. Thanks, Knut. We do have one question thus far, and feel free to hold up your hand or type in other questions if anyone has any other. The question is regarding the fee to join the affiliate program.
Yep. We have
affirmation. Let me use the right word. Affirmation program.
Okay. We have a scaled fee structure that starts with for a firm with under $100 million in assets at $250 annually, and then it goes up from there. And then for those advisors who are not managing assets and are working on the basis of time or projects, it's $175 for the first advisor in the firm, and then $100 for each additional advisor, and that's where the fee structure starts there.
Are there any other questions at this time? Feel free to raise your hand and I'll take you off mute and you can speak, or type in questions about what the details of the practice standards are, anything like that. I read through the document with the explanation and did have a couple of minor questions. So, okay, got some additional questions. Are you going to have a Find an Advisor section on your website?
Well, on both the Institute website and the Campaign for Investor website, which Mary will discuss, the advisors are listed. They are listed alphabetically, and that's where they can be found right now.
Okay. And another question, why is the fee associated with AUM?
Well, one of the fee structures is associated with AUM because that's how many fee-only advisors operate. But in addition to that, we have the fee structure associated based on the number of advisors in the firm. As I said, starting with a single advisor at a fee of $175 per year.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And for those large firms with significant assets, I glanced at the schedule and it becomes big for some. But you want to talk about that end of the spectrum?
At that end, and I think I think in terms of firms that we're involved in, I think the largest firm right now is just over $5 billion in assets, and that is We Family Offices. And I think that at that level, the fee structure I think is $5,500 per year for the firm.
Okay.
So that's
Gives people an idea.
That's at the other end. Yes.
Okay, great. One feedback is I don't see why AUM firms should pay more, and I'm an hourly planner. So just somebody
All right.
curious about that.
Well, let me. This is Mary. Let me
Sure.
respond to that a little bit too. You know, the Chairman's Council is a group of fairly large firms. They provide a little extra financial support to the organization because we are not, you know, taking donations, shall we say, from industry vendors. So we are totally supported by our advisors, and the Chairman's Council is a group of larger firms, and they support the idea of having larger firms pay a little more. And I think it's also because when their names are listed right next to an hourly advisor, you know, they have the potential, because of maybe their marketing, their exposure, their, you know, just notoriety in the media to gain a little more interest from investors. So I think it's an appropriate, but thank you for your comment.
Sure, thank you. And the next question may be a good segue into the campaign for investors, but maybe it needs to come up now. So is the plan for the Institute and marketing the affirmation program, is it a plan to, how will the Institute promote the best practices and those who have adopted best practices as far as advisors who would be participating in an affirmation program?
Well, let me.
Okay, go ahead, Mary. Go ahead.
Yeah, let me just say that I'll talk a little bit in a minute about the campaign for investors, but there's really a dual-pronged approach to the notion of creating and abiding by higher standards, fiduciary standards, than the industry currently subscribes to. And one of the things, Knut, I'm hoping you'll touch on is relative to the CFP board standards that have just been produced. What the point of view is of the Institute toward those standards. But let me just say that there's a two-pronged approach. We are working very diligently on the campaign for investors, putting the notion of you can have a fiduciary advisor, and here's what that means, out to the public, helping them and giving them lots of tools to evaluate their advisor and then find a fiduciary advisor. So that's one angle of it, but really the angle related to the advisory community is something that the advisors who are part of best practices, it's important for them to say, I subscribe to this notion of the standards that I keep, and I think the rest of our industry should be keeping. So it's also a self-motivating kind of thing for us to, the more the merrier is the bottom line, and the more we can pull the industry in to say, you know, and pound our fist on the table and say, this is what we stand for, the better. And so we are moving in both directions with investors and with advisors, and we look forward to the best practice advisors providing, you know, kind of the buzz at conferences and in blogs and in ways in which they can say this is what we need to be doing as an industry. So I hope that helps.
Yeah. Yes.
Great. Thanks.
let me add just a little bit more to that in terms of I think Mary's point about there is a key part of, I think, the value, the benefit of the Best Practices Affirmation Program that goes beyond true fiduciaries having yet another way to stand out on their website that they are true fiduciaries. Our experience is, frankly, that for the vast majority of our practices, they are already adopted and met by NAPFA members, Garrett members, etc., etc., etc. What is the other part of it is which Mary touched on is providing the strongest possible voice from the best practice advisors in the what I refer to as the public square to say that this is what investors should expect from an advisor, and this is what all advisors who want to meet investor expectations should be able to offer. This gets back to the best practice advisors helping lead this movement, helping lead in this direction towards a profession, and I think that is an absolutely key part of it. That there needs to be a greater voice. There need to be more voices out in the industry explaining why this is what a reasonable investor should expect, and it's not something that should be negotiable. And that so that's a key part of it. The second sort of piece, I think, in terms of what Mary touched on, and which I did not touch on in my presentation, was how do the best practices compare to the standards offered by the CFP board. And the short answer to that is that as I read thus far the new CFP board standards, there are either 3 or 4 of our 12 best practices which are required of all CFPs in the new standards. There is some gray area there which is not yet clear to me in terms of where the CFP board is going to fall out. But I say either 3 or 4 of our practices are required of all CFPs under the new standards. In our view, this is a significant difference. And so anyway, that's a piece I want to touch on.
And
okay.
And let me just add to that by saying that that there are definitely standards in the best practices that are not part of what is being required. For instance, the disclosure of cost. That's probably the biggest hurdle that the CFP Board of Standards has to get over, which is that an investor deserves the information about what it costs for them to engage and take the recommendations of the advisor. So that's a very big one that is yet to be even approached by the CFP Board of Standards.
Very good. We may have some more questions about the proposal from the CFP board throughout the discussion. May not be able to get to those or answer those, but it's an important subject, and I'm glad you guys brought that up and wove it in to part of your comments. A question back to the affirmation program. our firm adopts the best practices. We affirm that we are following them. We post that to our website. We pay the fee. Is there an auditing mechanism or a policing mechanism? How does one know, and how do we prove adherence to these standards?
That's an excellent question. In the inboarding process that we've experienced so far, Cheryl, many times there's conversations back and forth about particular practices, and frankly, there have been firms that have reached out to us that have learned that they're not there yet. They're not meeting the 12 best practices, and the conversation stops for the time being. So the first part of it is the inboarding process to answer any questions about what these practices mean, and so that's a form of the screen. But the second part, and I think the key part here is that we require something that, to my knowledge, no other group requires, and that is very specifically to hold out to, be it the SEC or be it the state securities regulator, that this is what we do, and this is what our firm stands for, and that is a significant mechanism for enforcement in a way that we don't see elsewhere, because as everyone on this phone knows, that when they hold themselves out either on their website or in other communications to doing something, whatever it is, that when the SEC or the state regulators come to your door, you are likely to be held accountable for exactly that. So that is, at the time, our enforcement mechanism. I will just add separately to that we have had internal discussions that have focused on what additional enforcement compliance mechanisms we can add to that, but those are just discussions at this point.
That sounds like a pretty dang good argument to me, is when you boldly hold out, and we have regulators that are policing this. That sounds pretty significant to me. Another question: what does it mean by disclosure on Form ADV?
What that means is that on Form ADV Part 2, which goes into detail on several parts from Part 1, there are 2 or 3 places on that, and we have purposely not subscribed exactly where it has to be on Part 2, but somewhere in Part 2 you have to place the language which is on our website, which is about 100 words, 120 words, that communicates to the regulator that you do subscribe to the Institute for the Fiduciary Standards Best Practices. So that's what that means. It's got to be on that Part 2 somewhere.
Does that language coincidentally also comply with the requirement from the DOL rule to affirmatively accept your fiduciary duty?
No, it does not. It specifically references the 12 best practices that the firm is holding itself out to complying with. It does not include the DOL rule.
Gotcha. Okay. Are there any other questions before we shift on to more about the campaign for investors? Anything more about the Best Practices Affirmation Program? Of course, I do encourage anyone who's got any questions or interest level, follow up. It doesn't take long to find out everything that's available. The documents themselves are simple and straightforward. I'm a very big fan because of some of the things that have been described thus far today. For me, it helps to articulate what the the customer, what the prospective client, what the client should expect in working with a true fiduciary. And we hear that from the press and the media and prospective clients and people who are looking for very good advice and direction from a fiduciary. They're always looking for, how do I find one? And, you know, even if they hear that, you know, hey, I'm a fiduciary, well, they don't know what it means. And the words on the best practices disclosure document, if you will, you know, the list of these 12 points and what they mean, are actually, I think, digestible to most, if not all, of our clients. And definitely with a tiny bit of explanation, we could easily make them digestible to all of our clients. And so I love the fact that it's helping to empower the public to know why they care about having a fiduciary.
Yeah,
anything else, Mary? Go ahead.
Let me just say that the website to learn more about best practices is thefiduciaryinstitute.org. So you can go there, learn what you need to, you can look at the 12 best practices and look at more about how to apply. Great.
Do you promote best practices advisors any help in explaining to investors how they differ? So what kind of help?
Well, let's
is this your part, Mary?
Yeah, this is a perfect segue. Why don't we go to that? And Knut, if you can advance one screen. Thank you. So I have to apologize off the top here. I took some screenshots, so you'll have to bear with me. There's a little bit of heading here, but basically the campaign for investors is campaignforinvestors.org. You can go there now and poke around with me if you'd like. What we're trying to do is, this is the second prong, second and very important prong, which is to move right directly to the investor and help them navigate this whole world of advice. The top screen here is to just say to investors, there's a series of slides, but to say, you know, advice makes a huge difference in your life. So we're trying to touch with people on how many other parts of their life good advice has made a huge difference. So we have a doctor and a patient here. There are a couple of different key areas on this website that we are focusing. One is on evaluating your financial advisor, the button on the left, the calculate your investing costs, which we have provided an opportunity for investors to do that, and understand your rights as an investor. If you could go to the next slide.
I have to interrupt, Mary. I can't imagine how many of us are just hankering to go dive into those 3 sections and check them out.
Well, let's do a little diving here. So there's a section called Investor Tools, and what we're trying to do is help investors evaluate where they are now. So do I need a financial advisor? You can click on that and it'll walk you through a series of questions about whether you have the assets and whether you have financial planning questions and so forth. The second, another item here is, does my advisor put my interests first? So how do I know? So these are little questionnaires that people can fill out. They can find out whether investors, other investors have filed a complaint against their advisor. They can discuss or learn a little bit more about what they could expect working remotely with a financial advisor. So the idea is that not every person needs to find an advisor who's in their own town, because the best practices registry of advisors is growing, but it's not, you know, there's not a best practice advisor in every town in the U.S. at this point in time. And then how do I feel about my financial advisor? You know, it's just sort of gut feeling. You know, am I happy? Do I know what my costs are? If I could save on some of the costs, if I could lower my investment expenses and have more for retirement, would I change my financial advisor? So these are questions that we're able to draw out for an investor on how motivating them to think about this. If you could go to the next slide. We have a couple of more tools, investor tools. How can I find an advisor who uses best practices? So here's where they can click on the registry and go directly to a list of the best practice advisors. We've put the John Oliver piece, I'm sure you've all seen it. That's on several of the pages. What are my rights as an investor? So this is a, it's sort of the flip side of the best practices for advisors. It's the best practices that investors should expect. So we have kind of a bill of rights that investors can actually download, take it, read it, ask their advisor some of the questions related to it. They can calculate their investment costs. Now this is a little complicated right now for investors because we have to send them to a group called FIEX. If you haven't heard of FIEX, you should know about them. They're a company that is their whole purpose. This is the guy who started Waze, and it's an Israeli firm, and their whole purpose is to create not investment tools, but apps and software that save people money. So what they do here is you can enter your account information, and it will go in and scrape your account and calculate all the fees that currently exist inside your accounts. So one of the ideas here is if you're a financial advisor and you'd like to support the prospective clients that come to your website and are poking around, you can send them to the campaign site and, you know, help them evaluate. I think it's a goodwill kind of thing to say, you know, here's a site where if you're concerned about whether you should be changing your advisor or looking for an advisor with these qualities, I'm on this list, and here are some tools that you can use to evaluate what you have. We also have a tell your story piece. So these are some of the tools that we have. If you could go to the next slide. We also have, I have a financial advisor, so here's what I need to do, and I need a financial advisor. So here is the way in which the registry is listed. At this point in time, I've just shown you the first couple of names. You can click on their website. We also have firm details, which if they're provided to us, will provide information like, do we do financial planning, do we have minimums, and so forth. So that's the way in which the best practice advisors are listed on our site and available to investors. And I think if you could go to I think there's one more slide here.
I'm sure there is. Let me check. No.
No. Okay. So
okay.
Go ahead and go to the last slide. That just gives you the websites. And as I said, if you have any questions about the campaign, we're also tracking a lot of that information. For instance, people who fill out questionnaires like, how do I feel about my financial advisor? We're collecting that data so that we can actually take a look and see how people are feeling about their advisor, and even provide information to the media at a later date when we have a little more information. So happy to take some questions.
Okay, couple of questions right now. Someone mentioned they have tried FIEX for their personal accounts, and it did show the cost of all the investments, but it did not show the cost for the custodian charges to maintain the account. I did the same for my 401k, and I did get all the costs to appear.
Okay.
Does anybody have any further knowledge about that? I've done a couple of demonstrations with FIEX, and we can follow up online about that
yeah,
issue.
Just a comment is our site, the campaign site, sends investors, if it shows some screenshots and they can go over to FIEX. They have to open an account, log in, put in their passwords for their investment accounts, and our suggestion is that once they've entered those passwords, they then get the information from the FIEX and then go back and change their passwords so that they can have a little sense of security on that information. But what we know is that FIEX does not use that information in any way. If you want to leave your stuff open on FIEX, they will send you a monthly report saying, you know, you just got a grade of F, you just got a grade of A, whatever. But they will provide ongoing feedback to you about how fees are changing in your.
Actually, it feels like maybe I'm getting them weekly. It's I've had at least 2, and it's been less than 2 months since I did it. I think.
You can get rid of that.
So,
you just have to.
Another question that we have here: do you help investors interpret the responses that non-fiduciary advisors are likely to give and what they really mean?
Well, you know, this is a good example of there's a lot of information we can put on the campaign. We'd love to put that information on the campaign. We're like, you know, running as fast as we can. And if, for instance, one of our registry advisors has a great article that, you know, lays that kind of information out, and you'd like it to be posted on our blog with your name on it, that's fine with us. So feel free as you to send us that kind of information as a registry advisor, and we'd be happy to do that. But that's a great example of something we want to do for the investors that are coming to our site.
Yeah, I had the experience of hearing from people who said, you know, they talked to an advisor and they asked them the "Are you a fiduciary?" question. You know, or it was on a questionnaire or something, and the responses that came back were, "I'm not a fiduciary, but my firm is," or "You don't need a fiduciary unless you're incapable of managing your own financial affairs." In other words, like a guardian or custodian or a, you know, custody kind of, I don't know, who knows, but definitely not a fiduciary. But it sounded so legal and so informative and declarative of proof that the individual believed it to be true. And so the problem is people don't know what fiduciary means, but they have been told by the press, which fortunately, that they want one. You want a fiduciary, but they don't necessarily know what that means. So anybody says, "Hey, I'm a fiduciary," and they go, "Okay, good, because I needed one of those. Now let's go. Here's my money," you know. And so I think that this kind of information is really helpful because it's illuminating what should you expect as a client of a fiduciary.
Right, and that's why they're concrete, verifiable, and you know, investors, they're really not asking, "Are you a fiduciary?" They're asking, "Are you going
to do what I expect, what I hope?"
What I expect, exactly.
Okay. Next question. Do you plan to start an advertising program like the CFP board did a few years ago? Well, maybe not in the same size, but...
No, not at this point in time, because I think you're talking millions and millions of dollars.
Yeah, I think their initial 2 years was like $9 million or something, and then decided to renew it. I think I'm putting words in you guys' mouth, but I think it's more of a grassroots, literally. The fiduciaries of the world need to raise awareness. It's for our own benefit, it's for our clients' benefit, it's for society's benefit. So it's going to take those loudmouth, do-gooders out there, all of you on the call, to help spread the word. Next, please,
let me
Mary.
say quickly too is that this is supported. There is no industry support here. So the ability for you to send this out to your media list and have articles written about the campaign or about the best practices is there. I mean, it's very, very important to do that.
Absolutely, yeah. And articles in the media are better than ads. Well put, Bob. Thank you. Next question. Could the Garrett Planning Network be a / the member? Granted, this would mean all members would have to accept the standards. Actually, it's based on RIA firm. So each RIA firm, so Garrett Investment Advisors could be sign on to the Best Practices Affirmation Program, and that's what I hope we will be doing. And that's what I'm anticipating. Individual RIA firms can do the exact same thing.
Right.
Unless I'm missing something as far as what the benefit would be of joining as a group. But I think the real benefit is the numbers. We want to show the masses out there, whether it's through the media or the public in general, that there are a lot of different firms who embrace these best practices as fiduciaries. They're easy to understand. We're willing to say, I'm a proud flag waving fiduciary. Come and get it. You know, we're not shy. We're not going, yeah, I'm a fiduciary, and then, you know, keeping it quiet. I think just, you know, being loud, flag-toting folks is the main thing. So without the numbers, I think collectively we actually lose strength in this kind of an event. Back to Knut and Mary for their feedback.
Right.
Mary, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Cheryl, you got it right on target in terms of, I think, what type of energy / resources is going to move this effort forward. It is grassroots. It is going to come from the advisors themselves in terms of how well and how often and how and to what extent they can speak out loudly. So I think that's absolutely right. And there are more and more examples I think we see in other places where these grassroots efforts that are now particularly more recently fueled by social media take on an energy of their own that is totally separate from traditional sort of mass advertising. So I appreciate your perspective on this, Cheryl. Thank you.
And I just want to
thank you very much.
In conclusion, thank you all for joining and learning more about best practices. I hope you will mention this to your financial advisory friends and really take a serious look at this. I know you have a busy day, but a week and month and year, but this is really bigger than our businesses individually. It's about bringing saving, let me say, it's about saving fiduciary for investors.
Yeah, very good. Well, thank you, Knut and Mary, so much for your time. Thank you for all of you who joined the call today on behalf of the Garrett Planning Network and NAPFA and others who joined. Thank you very much for being here. And I strongly encourage you to take a few minutes to go to the fiduciaryinstitute.org, both showing on the screen. We'll have this in the event summary, but go check out the document, the 12 best practices. It's simple. And then the detail about what these mean, it's very, very explanatory. I don't think it's a big investment of your time, and I think it's really worth it. You invested an hour with us today, take another hour to check it out and ask questions and see if it's right for your firm. And secondly, I love the campaignforinvestors.org website, what it stands for, what it's trying to help do, and so, you know, both of them. And that's it for me. Thank you for being here. Knut, thank you for everything that you've done. Mary, thank you, for everything that you've done as well.
Thank you, sure.
That's it. So for more information, contact both of you.
Yep.
Do you have a contact screen?
Oh.
Or info at these
think
organizations?
Yeah, there's info at.
Yeah, info at for both cases, absolutely.
Info at these various websites, and you will get to email them. Okay, thanks everyone. Great call. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.